This is episode 22 of the podcast Communicate Like This. Episode 22 is titled Blame versus Accountability. As I record this today, we're still in the middle of the whole coronavirus epidemic and under stay-at-home orders from our governor in the state of Washington, Jay Inslee. It's been a few weeks since the last episode, but today I wanted to reestablish some sense of normalcy, at least in my life, so I took the proactive step to do that with finally getting back in front of the microphone with this episode. While there's still plenty of material for us to cover, since this really is a never-ending process of self-improvement to reduce arguments, stress, misunderstanding, and miscommunication, because of my time gap between the last episode and this one, my momentum has slowed down a little bit. Before I started to record again, I was reminded of a statement from my co-founder of Flying Pig Brewing, Rob. When we were trying to come up with a name for our latest batch of homebrew, and we were flailing about hopelessly with basically no ideas, he made the profound comment that we can't even muster a fart of an idea. Now, luckily, the Pig Brothers got past that bit of writer's block, and now I've been able to get back in the flow with this episode called Blame versus Accountability. Now, who's really accountable for there being a gap between episodes and not being able initially to come up with a theme for this episode? Well, I could blame the coronavirus for one. I could blame Governor Inslee. I could blame the time that I've been spending on my current consulting venture. I'm sure I could come up with a list of tens of things or people to blame, but by now, you know and I know that the real culprit here is me. The ability to look at yourself first when things aren't going right plays a big role in getting things done. We've talked before about how theoretically it should be easier to fix yourself than fix others, since you have a lot more control over you than others. The habit that most people have of looking at others to blame before themselves is only that, a habit. Sure, pride is involved to make you not want to look at yourself first. After all, you're perfect, right? I mean, how could you possibly be to blame for the situation that you find yourself in? It's always the other person's fault. But if that's your attitude and approach, then you'll never be able to climb out of whatever hole you find yourself in. You'll always be plagued by arguments, stress, misunderstandings, and miscommunication. That's not the way I want to live my life. I don't think that it's the way you'd like to live your life either. So you've got to do something different than what you've been doing if you want to get out of the cycle that you're in. Let's take an example I was talking to a friend about just a few days ago. He had an employee at work that he wanted to have change his approach to managing people. Now, my friend seemed to have all of the requisite expectations put in place, and he'd even put those into the employee's evaluation. But whenever he would talk to the employee about the issue, the employee would plead that he was doing his best. Maybe his best wasn't good enough, but he tried everything, and maybe he should just give up. Well, then the employee would be upset and down on himself for several days after that, and then take it out on his team, which then would lead to more complaints from his team. The interesting thing here is that my friend essentially kept having the same conversation over and over again with the employee, to the point that my friend knew exactly what to expect from each and every conversation. Yet, no actions ever changed. My friend and the employee were caught in a spin cycle of a washing machine and couldn't get out of it. Ever had that feeling with relationships or discussions you had with your friends or family? Sometimes someone even says, "Haven't we had this discussion before?" So, how do you get out of that spin cycle? Do something different. Anything different, but something different. Take action. Like Marshawn Lynch always says, it's all about that action, boss. The first step you can take is sort of change the topic of the conversation you continually have with the other person about a given issue, and make the topic instead about doing something different about this topic of conversation. When the issue comes up again and you start down that same path, headed for the same pothole that you always step into, like Bill Murray does in Groundhog Day, do something different. My suggestion is to overtly say, hey, here we go again. Same issue, same discussion, same result. What if we talk to each other instead about what we could do differently when this topic comes up again in the future? Let's not talk about the topic itself. We're getting nowhere with that. Instead, let's talk about how to avoid ending up in the stalemate that we usually seem to get to, with both of us frustrated. Basically, what I'm saying here is put the real issue on the table. Talk about the elephant in the room. Tell the emperor he has no clothes. But do it together, looking at the situation as two neutral third-party observers or consultants who could offer advice about how to more effectively communicate in this given situation. But do it together as a team. Don't blame each other, but instead hold each other accountable for the role that you both play in the relationship. What's the difference between blame and accountability, you may ask? Well, that's what the subject of this podcast is about today. Well, blame is a much more emotional version of accountability. It's usually pointing fingers at others in order to deflect the spotlight from being turned back on you. Oftentimes, you're mad at someone about something, so you make the matter worse by accusing them, by blaming them. There's almost a vengeance or a retribution aspect of blame. Blame turns up the wattage on the spotlight and points that spotlight straight at the other person, right into their eyes. Oftentimes, those people shining the spotlight get some warped sense of gratification by making others feel less than. Me? I'm better than you. Look how you screwed this up. This is all your fault. I'm blameless here, but you certainly aren't. That's blame. Accountability, however, is a much more logical, less emotional way of pointing out when a given situation or expectation that was either complied with or not complied with. It's more in tune with a business issue and a lot of the time associated with integrity, meaning someone didn't do what they said that they would do by when they said they would do it. Accountability is there for the purposes of helping your teammate ultimately succeed by learning from their mistakes. It's not there to make the other person feel bad about themselves, which is what blame often does. True accountability is the positive, light side of the situation versus the negative, dark side of blame. It's a much more black and white approach or a binary issue. Either the person acted in alignment with whatever the expectation was, or they didn't. It's more of a statement of fact than an emotional blame. Again, it's about a business issue, not about the personal characteristics of the person that's in the spotlight. Blame is a drill sergeant screaming in the private's face. Accountability is a coach helping correct the situation and prevent it from happening again. Now, how do you handle it when you're held accountable? Many people lash out in a purely defensive mode to deny that they're anything but perfect and turn that spotlight around on the person who was originally shining the spotlight on them. It's a classic case of deflection. And what happens with that approach? Well, most often an argument and stress ensue. What if instead you had the ability to look at the situation objectively and admit your role in it? This isn't some superhero ability that is only available to a few chosen ones. It's an ability that each of us has within ourselves if only we would stop and think and tap it first before getting all defensive on others. It's a learnable skill that gets easier and easier each time you use it. Humility is generally thought of as a positive characteristic of people. Your ability to admit that you were wrong forces humility onto you. And best of all, you know what the consequences of humility are? Making conversation more effective. It's not death, yet some people cling to that concept that they can't possibly be wrong as if it were a matter of life and death. I'm here to tell you that admitting you're wrong is a freeing experience. It lightens whatever load may be weighing you down. Whew, I got that burden off my shoulders. And look, I'm still alive and still able to function in society. How about that? And you know what other benefit comes from admitting you're wrong and accepting accountability? It makes you more human in the eyes of others. And that opens up more opportunities for effective communication because others learn that you won't be trying to weasel your way out of things. You become a person who can be trusted. Another benefit of admitting your role in the situation is that it totally takes the wind out of the sails of the accuser. The blamer generally wants to pile on, to continue to ridicule you and make fun of you for having done something wrong. But you can put a stop to that with a simple, you know, you may be right. I shouldn't have done that, and I apologize. Plus, I'll try really hard not to do that again. It's kind of a Tai Chi move where you take the energy of the other person that's coming at you and incorporate it in you and then turn it around to use it on them. I mean, where does the accuser go if you've already admitted your role in the issue? There's nothing left for them to blame unless they just want to keep endlessly repeating the blame over and over again, which probably some people do, but it becomes much harder to do that when you can just sit there calmly and say, yeah, I know. I'm really sorry I did that. Plus, that approach now opens the door to discuss the accuser's role in the situation, if the accuser actually did help precipitate the situation. You've already bared your soul and survived to tell about it, so the implication is that the other person could do the same. Just make sure that when you do turn that spotlight around to the accuser, that you're doing it with the good intentions of accountability versus the bad intentions of blame. Let me tell you about a situation I was just recently involved in when someone told me that an employee was now in another department. That seems pretty clear, doesn't it? Bob is now working in the mail department. That's the statement made to me. Bob is now working in the mail department. See any assumptions that might be in play here? Initially, I certainly didn't, and I consider myself to be more highly attuned to recognizing assumptions than the average person. Maybe a little hubris there, but it ain't bragging if you can do it, said Muhammad Ali. Regardless, what assumptions can you think of with that otherwise straightforward statement that Bob is now working in the mail department? How could that possibly be misinterpreted? Well, give it a little bit of thought. Think about some assumptions that may be in play here. So for me, what happened is that statement set off a whole series of actions that needed to take place, since the last I knew, Bob was working in the purchasing department. Now, a departmental change for any person in any company is usually accompanied by all sorts of human resources activities. Was the company org chart updated? Did Bob have a raise? Did his hours change? Was he promoted? Was there a personnel issue involved in the transfer? Why wasn't the normal transfer process used? Since I work in human resources, this new bit of information that I didn't know anything about before set off all sorts of alarm bells for me. So I set in action a variety of requests and process clarification issues that needed to be addressed. At least I thought needed to be addressed. So now that you've had maybe a little time to think about it and listen to me at the same time, do you have any assumptions in mind that were associated with the statement, Bob is now working in the mail department? Well, here's the assumption that led to my, in hindsight, overreaction. I mentally added one little word to that statement as an assumption without really even knowing it. So instead of what was said, what I heard was Bob is now permanently working in the mail department. Now, how easy was that assumption to make? Pretty easy, like many assumptions, and I didn't recognize it at the time. What the person who told me about Bob could have said was, Bob is temporarily working in the mail department. He's still reporting into the purchasing department. Now, that's what they meant to say, but for lack of a single word in that verbal communication, they left an opening for an assumption to come into play. And I jumped headfirst into that opening. A key concept of effective communication is to say what you really mean and eliminate, to the greatest degree possible, any assumptions that may come into play. The more you develop the skill of anticipating when assumptions could be made as the conversation continues, and then stopping the conversation to put the assumption on the table, the better you'll be at true effective communication. So, what did that story have to do with my accountability? Well, once I realized the assumption I made, I owned up to it and took accountability for my role in creating the confusion about all of these processes that needed to be put in place and all these questions that needed to be answered. Yes, I started out on the path of defending myself because the statement seemed pretty clear to me. Bob is now working in the mail department. But I realized that's what I was doing. So I took the approach that diffused the situation. I pointed out the assumption I made once I figured out what that assumption was. Once I looked to myself to help fix the issue got fixed. I took accountability for my part in the play. That, in turn, opened up the opportunity for the other person to see where their communication was less effective than it could have been by creating holes for assumptions to fill it up with. It also led to a conversation with a third person about keeping people fully informed, which is another form of effective communication. So there were some positive outcomes to this, but at the time it was a bit frustrating simply because of the assumption of one word. So let me summarize the lessons here to achieve more effective communication. First, look to yourself to fix an issue. Second, accept and admit accountability for something you did, remembering that accountability can be for positive things as well as negative things. You know, if you did something good, take accountability for that. That's great. That's kind of the positive side of accountability. Third, don't get defensive. Fourth, work with the other person on ways to not get caught in the spin cycle versus just starting up the same old disagreement again. And fifth, anticipate potential assumptions others might make with your statements and clarify to avoid those assumptions. Think of this in terms of what type of culture you'd like to live in. One where people are screaming and yelling at each other, or one where people are working cooperatively together to help one another get better. I know I'd rather live in the latter, and I think society would function much more smoothly if we had more people on that latter track. What if it were no big deal in this culture to say, it's my fault. Let's figure out how to not have it happen again and move on. The person shouldn't be raked over the coals for a mistake. Just fix the mistake and move on is the right attitude. Can you set aside your pride to admit a mistake? Are you flexible enough and confident and secure enough in your own person to admit that you're not perfect? Can you also promise to try not to do whatever it was that you shouldn't have done again? The bottom line is you have to in order to progress towards that goal of mutual understanding and reducing arguments, stress, misunderstandings, and miscommunication. Once you think you've fixed yourself, then look again and see where else you might improve. Now, just a caution here that you should never believe that you've been completely fixed. That's what continuous improvement's about. Don't delude yourself into thinking you've fixed yourself without checking in with other people with whom you interact. Their honest opinion, assuming that you can truly get an honest opinion versus one that isn't open and honest and tries simply just not to hurt your feelings, their honest opinion is probably your best guide to who you really are versus your own self-analysis of the situation. Now it's time for the Poetry Corner. Today we'll discuss the Scottish poem by Robert Burns titled To a Louse, on seeing one on a lady's bonnet at church. That includes the lines that I'll now speak in my best butchered Scottish. O wad some power the giftie gie us, to see ourselves as others see us. I don't know how good that was or not. Sounded sort of Scottish to me. But from Wikipedia, the poet, Robert Burns, notices a lady in church with a louse, that is, the insect, a louse that is kind of roving around in her bonnet, unnoticed by her. Burns then reflects that to a louse, we are all equal prey, and that we would be disabused of our pretensions if we were to see ourselves through each other's eyes. That is to say, we would have no pretensions because we're all viewed the same. Here's kind of the English language translation of the whole poem to kind of bring home the point, so I won't butcher the Scottish language anymore, or at least the accent. Here's that translation. Oh, would some power give us the gift to see ourselves as others see us. It would from many a blunder free us, and foolish notion, what airs in dress and gait would leave us, and even devotion. Hey, who'd have thunk that this podcast would not only teach you how to more effectively communicate, but that you'd actually get some intellectual high-class literature to boot. We are a multifaceted podcast. Tell your friends. That's about it for today. Thanks again for listening. Remember, you can leave comments directly at the podcast's home site of Libsyn, that's Libsyn, at www.communicatelikethis.com. Your feedback is really so important to keeping me on point and makes the podcast more current with real-life examples of how you all are using this stuff to really reduce arguments, stress, misunderstandings, and miscommunication. Keep it coming. Remember that many of these concepts are found in my management book, Uncommon Sense Management, so if you want to get it all at once in one place, pick up that book from Amazon or on Kindle. As always, it's all about that action, boss. Talk to you next time.